early hours of Friday morning. Archangel Michael came flying into the garden, accompanied by a squadron of his finest soldiers. "They're coming," he exclaimed urgently. I reached down and gently shook the still form of Jesus. "It's time," I said. Jesus looked refreshed. His eyes were clear, the lines on his face less deep. In his spirit there was a sense of purpose. The image I saw as I looked into his thoughts was of an arrow which had just left its bowstring, speeding directly towards its target. Jesus in turn shook his 3 companions awake, urging them to pray. Before he'd finished talking, the quiet of the garden was invaded. Lucifer, the leader of the opposition, led the way. Behind him came a band of demonic thugs who positioned themselves directly in front of Michael and his force. Lucifer momentarily turned to me with a look that said, "This is my operation, don't you dare interfere." Behind him walked Judas, leading a small crowd of priests and temple guards. Judas walked straight past his startled friends and headed for Jesus. He walked towards us with his head held high, his arms outstretched and a smile on his face. "Hello, teacher," he said, and threw his arms around Jesus, kissing him on the cheek. "Judas, are you betraying me with a kiss?" Jesus asked. But Jesus had no chance to reply. Judas had no chance to reply. Rough hands threw him aside. The same hands grabbed Jesus and pushed him to the ground, passing ropes around his arms while a sword was held threatening in his face. Peter leapt into the fray, brandishing a dagger and shouting incoherently. In a blind rage, he managed to cut one of Jesus' captors on the side of the head. Jesus shouted, "Enough of this!" He stood up in the centre of the muddled heap of men and everyone looked at him, surprised that their intended victim should take control. First, Jesus spoke to Peter. "Put your weapon away. Don't you know that I could call up 12 armies of angels to defend me?" Lucifer glanced round at me anxiously, the smile vanishing from his face. I ignored him. Next, Jesus turned to the leaders among the priests. "Am I a terrorist that you have come to get me with soldiers and weapons? Every day I have been with you in the temple." Lastly, he turned to his former assistant, now his deadly enemy. "Lucifer, this is your hour," Jesus said, "when darkness rules." I could feel Michael beside me, itching to capture his stunned adversary, but I did not give the order. Once again, the leader of the opposition tried to fathom the mind of his creator, but failed. Instead, frustrated, he pushed one of the officers of the guard, and he, in turn, shoved the backs of his men. They did the same to Jesus, and the whole sorry band began its journey out of the garden and down the steep hill towards Jerusalem. I followed at a distance with Peter, who was feeling utterly alone. He had no idea that he was accompanied by the most powerful military escort that heaven could provide. Instead, when he turned round, all he could see was that the rest of the 12, Judas included, had run away. Peter repeated to himself the promise that he had made to Jesus at supper: "I will go with you all the way to prison and even to death." As we made our way, the road was fenced with opposition forces. Long lines of rebellious spirits looked on in silent amazement as their leader brought the sun into Jerusalem under arrest. When they saw 2 archangels bringing up the rear with the troops against whom they'd fought for so long, they assumed that we too had been captured. They jeered and snorted at us as we passed. I no longer needed to share the son's emotions. I could feel the naked indignity of defeat for myself. This was, most certainly, their hour. Michael had never experienced anything to match this. He spat into my ear. "I have to get out of here somehow and raise our forces." I looked ahead to Jesus, still walking upright and confidently. There was no hint of the captured prisoner about him, and I suspected that if the temple's guard and opposition spirits were taken away, he would still be marching into Jerusalem to face his enemies. I muttered to Michael indifferently, "You can do what you like." Then I added more urgently, "But you must not interfere." The next time I looked around, he was gone. The arrest party made for a small door in the city wall beside the temple. Through the doorway and down a narrow private alley, we entered the courtyard of the high priest's house. Jesus was chained to 2 guards. Someone lit a fire, and gradually the people settled down. As they waited for something to happen, they gathered round the heat and light of the fire, chattering amongst themselves. I looked into the thoughts of the different people present, discovering that very few of them were interested in Jesus at all. They did not hate him. All this was simply something to alleviate the routine boredom of their lives. There was much speculation about what would happen to him, but most of the gathered guards and hangers-on really didn't care. There was, however, one person in the small crowd who did care. Peter had found himself a spot where he could sit in the shadows and watch Jesus. A servant girl was distributing wine supplied by the high priest to mark the night's Passover celebrations. When she came to Peter, she recognized him and declared to anyone who was listening, "This man was one of his followers." "What do you mean?" Peter retorted crossly. "I don't even know him." He buried his face in his wine cup. I looked across to Jesus, who'd recognized Peter's voice and was trying to locate his friend in the flickering firelight. After a while, boredom set in. One of the guards stood up. "I've got an idea," he announced. "This Jesus character is supposed to be a prophet. Let's see if he's any good at it. Anyone got a blindfold?" A cotton scarf was produced, which the guard tied around Jesus' eyes. He then tiptoed to one of his colleagues, whispered in his ear, and instructed Jesus to stand up. The second guard walked up to the blindfolded Jesus, slapped him hard on the cheek, and returned to his place. The first guard pulled away the scarf from Jesus' face and said playfully, "Go on then, who hit you?" Everyone laughed, and the guard, pleased at his success, repeated the process again and again and again. Each time Jesus said nothing, and each time, emboldened by his silence, the aggressor hit or kicked him harder than before. At one point, the guard invited Peter to take a turn. Peter declined, and the man said, "Are you one of them?" "No, I'm not," Peter replied gruffly. Someone else volunteered, and the game continued. When the officer in charge of the guard became concerned at the amount of blood on Jesus' clothes and the extent of the swelling on his face, he called a halt to the game. So the guard changed the rules from physical blows to verbal insults, and the sport continued. All the while, the cramped courtyard echoed with laughter. For me, this second game was worse. To sit and listen to living creatures idly mocking the one who'd so lovingly formed them and sustained their life was dreadful torture. Part of me would have happily crushed their feeble bodies there and then, but I reminded myself of the reason I was here. I looked closely at Jesus, his face a mosaic of bruises, his clothes smeared with dirt and blood. He was tired, but he was standing firm. Inside my mind, that arrow was still flying towards its mark. He was mostly ignoring the continual downpour of verbal abuse, except that he prayed momentarily for each person as they spoke. The majority of his thoughts were devoted to focusing on his Father's love, the last part of this mind given in repeated prayers for Peter. At one point, when the proceedings were interrupted by the arrival of more wine, I went right up to Jesus. "I just wanted to tell you I'm here," I whispered. "I'll do anything you ask me." I hoped he might instruct me to rescue him from this awful theatre of blasphemy, but he only said, "Thank you." As the night wore on and the fire died down, the people and their game grew tired. Jesus and his guards sat down. The blindfold was left on. Every time the game ground to a halt, someone came up with a fresh insult, but they rarely produced much laughter, and the guards had long since given up trying to get a reaction from Jesus. Gradually, the darkness gave way to the colourless light of early dawn, and when one of the guards pulled off Jesus' bloody blindfold to wipe his own nose, nobody seemed to notice. People were simply talking among themselves, wondering when they'd get home to their families and whether they'd be paid extra for their night's work. All of a sudden, one angry voice rose up above the others, its broad Galilean accent unmistakable. "Man, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know the man." It was Peter. And while he was denying any knowledge of Jesus, a cockerel announced the arrival of daytime, strutting importantly into the courtyard as it crowed. Jesus turned towards Peter, and for the first time since the Garden of Gethsemane, their eyes met. Inside Peter's mind, the massive tower of pride and self-belief which dominated his personality crashed into dust. He stumbled clumsily away from Jesus' gaze, his eyes pouring tears as he went. I turned to Jesus. In his thoughts, he was talking to the now absent Peter. "Peter, I always knew you might do that. I do not love you any the less now that I have heard what I have understood for so long." An hour after dawn. Not long after the cockerel had emerged from the high priest's house, it was followed by its owner. I was struck by the similarity between the two creatures. Both were small, with an exaggerated air of self-importance. Both looked overdressed, both loud, both hampered by a small brain. Caiaphas strutted past Jesus and squawked, "Bring him with me." With that, he disappeared through a private doorway into the temple complex. Jesus walked awkwardly, his limbs stiff from the injuries of the night. I followed him down dark stone corridors, empty of people but teeming with opposition spirits, all preoccupied with different errands. It seemed that the opposition had taken over the priest's quarters. The high priest Caiaphas was escorted by two senior opposition agents in much the way that Jesus was by his guards. Both men were captives. As we approached the council chamber, I saw a crowd of aggravated guardian angels who had been refused entry when their charges went inside. They flocked to me, demanding an explanation. "How can the Jewish council expect to achieve anything without us?" one asked. I directed their attention to their boss's son as he walked past. No other reply was necessary. At the entrance to the chamber, I met Jeshaphael, an angel I'd known very well before he betrayed our boss and was banished from heaven. "You can't go in," he told me bluntly. "If I do not follow the sun through that door," I said, "I shall go to fetch Michael and his entire army." Jeshaphael was trapped in indecision. Clearly, he had not been given authority to decide for himself, but equally clearly, he believed that he should have. Freedom and independence are luxuries that the leader of the opposition does not allow. He hovered with indecision. I made as if to leave, and quickly he told me to wait. Evidently, my presence was one eventuality Lucifer had failed to plan for. I was encouraged and pushed my advantage. "Maybe I should go and speak to your leader," I suggested. "No need for that," Jeshaphael replied. "Go in. You won't be able to do anything." He was probably right, but I was relieved to be with the sun again. I was also pleased at having forced a small crack in the enemy's ranks. Through that crack shone a faint ray of hope. Inside the council chamber, there was no waiting. As soon as Jesus arrived, the proceedings began. Lucifer swept into the chamber, prompting the hundreds of spirits in the room to focus their attention slavishly on his single purpose. When I looked around the room, those Jewish counsellors, still loyal to my boss, stood out from the rest. Their spines were tingling at the strong presence of evil around them. Behind the leader of the opposition came Caiaphas, the high priest, black robes billowing as he walked. He took his seat in the centre of the council chamber and called for Jesus' trial to begin. There were some brief formalities to confirm that the prisoner was indeed Jesus from Nazareth, itinerant teacher and healer. Jesus remained silent and refused to cooperate with this interrogation. I was surprised. I studied him closely to find out why. Again, I sensed the arrow hurtling towards its mark. His mind was focused on what lay ahead. He knew that the council of the Sanhedrin had already made up their mind. They didn't need his help. Caiaphas was irritated by Jesus' silence. He felt that his authority was being bruised. Before long, he lost patience and fired off the question that most concerned him. If you are the Messiah, the Saviour of the Jewish people, tell us. Jesus looked directly into his eyes. The council chamber is not a large room, and the two men were close to one another. Jesus has become an expert at reading the subtle messages published in every human face. In the high priest's face, he saw a cocktail of anxiety and doubt. Anxiety about losing the power and wealth he has fought so hard to achieve. Doubt at the faint prospect, in his judgment, that this country carpenter might just be sent by God. In his mind, he remembered that over 1,000 years before, his God had used another insignificant man from an obscure village, a man named Gideon. If I could have taken that fragment of honest doubt in the high priest's mind and inflated it to useful proportions, I would have done. But as he returned Jesus' gaze, Caiaphas' determination froze, and he became as hard as ice. If I were to tell you, Jesus replied, you wouldn't believe me. If I were to ask you what you believe, you would not give me an honest answer. But this much I will tell you. From now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of Almighty God. This reply delivered a hammer blow to Caiaphas' frozen will, where there was already weakness. Cracks emerged. Before the question, what if he really is the Messiah, could emerge to the surface of the high priest's mind, the leader of the opposition whispered into his thoughts a different, more dangerous question. Lucifer stood back and grinned with satisfaction. Caiaphas leant forward, weighed down by the gravity of his next inquiry. Are you, he asked solemnly, the Son of the Most High God? A gasp of shock emerged from almost every human mouth in the room. The high priest had said the unspeakable and put into words an idea that self-respecting Jews dare not even think. To pose so blunt a question, whatever rumours may have spread about Jesus, was shocking. Again, Jesus looked at his accuser, searching for remnants of faith and hope. Lucifer's smile faltered. His plan could still be scuppered if the faint embers of spiritual light in the priest's soul could be rekindled. My attention flicked from the priest to the former archangel to my boss's son. Everything hung at that moment in the balance of Caiaphas' mind. What did he care for most? His God or himself? Lucifer was not willing to risk his entire plan on the decision of the high priest. Without any noticeable signal, his lackeys forced the same simple question from the lips of anyone present who they could manipulate. Before long, the room was infected by a rising murmur of enquiry. Are you the Son of God? Individual voices rose above the noise. Answer him then. And are you or aren't you? At a signal from the leader of the opposition, the voices were hushed and the council chamber fell silent. "You are right," Jesus suddenly announced. "I am." The room erupted. Caiaphas's mind snapped shut and he ripped apart the fabric of his own official robes. Jesus had declared the ultimate blasphemy, and the men of the Sanhedrin wanted to stone him to death immediately. As I struggled to take in the angry chaos that surrounded me, I could see the faint lights of those who did believe Jesus to be my boss's son, but those lights were rapidly smothered by opposition spirits who surrounded them and bombarded them with fear of their own death should they reveal their support for the blasphemer. Caiaphas took control of his council. He'd prepared a schedule for the day, and now it was time to act. "Brothers," he shouted, calling the room to order, "we do not have the authority to put a man to death. We must take this prisoner to the Roman governor." His suggestion did not win the hearts of those who were baying for blood. The Romans were their immediate enemy, but the Roman ban on Jewish executions rarely stopped them. Nonetheless, Caiaphas was right, and there was something in his manner that compelled them to wait. The high priest's inner group of advisers stood and followed their leader to the door. The rest of the council were close behind. Only a few, those who secretly admired Jesus, slipped away quietly back to their homes. Jesus was escorted out of the temple buildings through a back gate and across the governor's courtyard to the praetorium. And here, we are waiting. Pilate, the Roman governor, seems to be in no hurry to satisfy the bloodlust of the Jewish council. The council members are milling around, gossiping excitedly. Lucifer has gathered his entourage to brief them. I am alone. Jesus is calm and his mind focused. I wish the same were true for me. I summoned Michael and a significant force of angels so that we can match the opposition presence. I am still committed to my boss's plan and intend to see it through, but there are so many things that could go wrong. I dare not leave us totally unprotected.